Hey everybody, Amy here again with another Dueling Rabbits Productions video about drawlooms and their ways. Today's thrilling installment is about designing and weaving damask borders. I really like to weave borders on my damask. I think they give individual pieces a more polished, intentional look. Whether complex or simple, borders need to be considered at design time and when setting up the pattern shafts and drawcords. Flexible approach means that a variety of borders can be added to projects on the same warp, which can really change the appearance and character of the individual pieces. In my previous video, I talked a bit about how I designed and wove the central panel of the blue napkin you see here. Today, I want to discuss in detail how the checkerboard frame for this piece was created. But first, I'd like to talk a little more generally about borders and look at a few examples. Here's one of the very first pieces I ever made on my Drawloom, a simple table mat. In the middle you can see the panel woven on repeated point threading. Around the edges I have these short little bars forming a frame around the entire piece with small squares at the corners. That's a pretty traditional approach. Here's another example with solid lines forming two square frames around the central motif. You can go kind of crazy and design borders with multiple elements. This one just has borders up the sides. Since it was a towel warp, I just kept weaving without a thought for horizontal borders at each end, and that's fine, I think. On my current warp, I've gone pretty wild, with very large frame borders that have lots of details in both symmetric and non-symmetric motifs, including lettering. With deep borders like these, it can be a challenge to make the overall proportions of the piece harmonious. Right now, let's concentrate on something simpler. Here's a red napkin with repeated point threading on pattern shafts in the center and a simple frame of stripes around the edges. Let's take a closer look at how it was threaded and woven. Here's the fiberworks draft for the piece. You can see the drawdown, the lift plan, and the pattern shaft threading. We'll ignore the tie-up box for now. This is a convenience for drawlooms that I'll discuss in my next video. The X shaft is here at the back, followed by 2 shafts for the borders, and then 19 shafts in a repeated point threading for the central panel. Let's look a little more closely at the border shafts. At the back, on the X shaft, we have 3 units on either side. These correspond to the unraised red units at the selvage and between the vertical border and central pattern here. On the next shaft, which I am calling shaft 1, there are 2 units on either side corresponding to the white stripes. On shaft number 2, there's only 1 unit on each side corresponding to the red stripe between the 2 white ones. This shaft is only raised when I weave the corner squares. It's important to note that because all 4 units for the white vertical stripes are on shaft 1, I can take care of all of them with a single pull, represented in the lift plan here. We need to think about the horizontal border at the top and the vertical borders at the sides differently. The horizontal border here is woven using the same 19 pattern shafts as the central panel. You can see we need to pull all 19 of them to make those horizontal white lines. In the first row of the border, we pull every shaft except the X shaft. In row 2, we pull border shafts 1 and 2 only. And in the third row, we pull all the shafts once again. When we're weaving the central panel and need the vertical stripes down the sides, we pull shaft 1 throughout. I always put my border shafts at the back of the loom. No matter how simple or complex the pattern they represent, I think about them and design for them separately. Let's see what that looks like when things become more complicated. Here's the piece with the very deep borders once again, but hopefully it will make more sense from a setup point of view now. The borders are really designed no differently than they were in the red piece we just looked at, except that there are more units attached to the Drawloom in a variety of ways. The lettering and this non-symmetric motif are single units. These two stripes are symmetric units on extra pattern shafts, and the horizontal border across the bottom, of course, has to be woven on the same pattern shafts in their pointed threading as the central panel. Let's look at the vertical borders a little more closely. Here's the drawdown for another piece in the same series. I've chosen it for the additional symmetrical motif in the corners, which makes it ideal for my Drawloom's combination attachment. The entire border could be woven using single drawcords or straight threading, as you can see here. I've enlarged the top half of the border so you can see it better. Here you can see the symmetry within the border. I do like to have odd numbers of units in my borders so there's a central turning point. I've shown that here in blue. If we cover up the units on the X shaft, which are sometimes raised in this piece, you can see that quite a lot of this border could be woven using the pattern shafts in a point threading to save time. Another possibility is to do away with symmetry altogether. I can do this by attaching all my border units to single pulls. Here's a draft I'm working on now for the same warp. If I ignore the pattern shafts and treat all the pulls independently, I can make the vertical borders as varied as I like. I would not have the same freedom with the horizontal borders, of course, unless I attached single drawcords to every unit in the central panel of the piece, which, yikes, I am not going to do. If I want to weave quickly or fuss less with single pulls, I can use pattern shafts only, even if the borders are very deep. Here's the piece from my previous video again with its checkerboard frame to remind you what it looks like. I'm now weaving a new piece with the same border, although the central panel is different. This is what I'd like to concentrate on for the rest of this video. Let's take a look at the drawdown before we go to the loom. Here's the bottom half of the Fiberworks draft. You can see Jensen and button, yarn balls, shuttles, and my big standard. I've changed the colors on the threading so you can see more clearly where the different units are located on the pattern shafts. Here at the back are my 8 units on the X shafts shown in yellow, 3 units on either selvage, plus 1 unit between the border and the central panel on both sides. Next are the border units, 74 of them, 37 on each side, in their single point threading over 19 shafts, shown in red. These units are also attached to single pull drawcords, which I am using for other pieces on this warp, but am ignoring now. While it's true that the single points might not be the most efficient threading for this particular border, they gave me maximum flexibility for the other pieces on this warp. Finally, we see the units shown in blue, which are the 145 units in their repeated point threading for the central panel. You'll notice once again that the horizontal border at the bottom is woven using the pulls for the central panel, whereas the vertical borders are woven using the pulls for the single point threading at the back. One pull takes care of units in both borders. Even though the diamond borders are easy to memorize, I've done a complete drawdown for this piece so I can be sure that my borders and central panel are in accord. For example, it is important to me that the diamonds match here, and that the turning points in the center of the piece occur in the same row. It also provides waypoints that I can check whenever I like to make sure that my weaving is going to plan. So now that we've seen what the threading of the pattern shafts looks like in theory, let's see what it looks like in practice. I'm looking at the front of my loom now so that you can get your bearings. I'm going to pan back to where the pattern shafts are so you can see how they're situated. The first group of shafts 1 through 19 are at the front, threaded in their repeated points for the central panel. The next group of shafts 1 through 19, one is behind the upright here, are threaded in their single points for the border, 1 point on each side of the warp. Tucked back away here are the units on my X shaft. If we then pan around and peer inside the threading at the pattern heddles, you can see what's going on even more clearly. At the front of the loom, farthest from us, are the 19 shafts for the central panel with their repeated point threading. If we pan back, there's the single point for the right-hand border, Right hand, that is, if I'm sitting and weaving, and the left hand border with its single point. Finally, here's the view from above the loom. At the front, you can just see the V's of the repeated points in their somewhat messy arrangement of heddles on the far shafts, and the much tidier arrangements of single points closer to us. If we turn our draft upside down, we can see it looks just the same. Let's go to the front of the loom now. Here we are, standing before the console. It has what I think of as two separate sets of pulls, one set for the central panel and one set for the vertical borders. My own convention is to put the pulls for the central panel on the left-hand side. Here you can see shaft 1, which is the one at the rear of the first group of shafts, all the way to shaft 19, which is the one at the front of the loom. Where possible, I like to leave a space between the two sets of pulls. To the right are the pattern shaft pulls for my vertical borders. Again, one is over here on the right through 19, which is here on the left. The X shaft is way over here on the right, where I can easily ignore it. Although it's attached to a pull that I will need for other pieces on this warp, for this one I will leave it be. So here's the piece that I'm working on now. We'll ignore the blue strip at the bottom. That's the hem of the previous piece, the bathroom, we were looking at in the other video. I'm weaving the next piece of the loom room in brown. Here's the beginning of it with its hem, and I'm almost done weaving the lower part of the piece. Since I want to frame around the entire central panel, you can see that for the first several inches, the pulls for the border and central panel are identical. Let's remind ourselves of how this is set up. There are 37 units here for the right-hand border, 37 units here for the left-hand border, and 145 units across the center. There are 3 X-shaft units at the selvage here, and 1 between the border and central panel here. This arrangement is mirrored on the other side. If we zoom in on the selvage, you can see that there is no special treatment going on, no doubled threads or floating selvage, and I think it looks just fine. You can also see that distinctive damask curl that we combat with pulls quite close to the edge. I have a few more rows to weave before my border is finished. First, I'll lift my borders. Shaft 1 goes up and you can see 4 units raised, 2 on each side. There goes shaft 10 with its 4 units. And finally, shaft 19 with its single turning point unit. Now I'll direct my attention to the central panel. Shaft 1 lifts the rearmost turning points for all 4 repeats. Shaft 10 lifts 8 more units across the repeats, and shaft 19 lifts the 4 turning points at the front of the loom. I'm now ready to start weaving. I'll throw my shuttle 6 times, rearrange my pulls, and repeat until I've reached the end of my border. Okay, so now that's done. The bottom frame is complete. Apart from the unraised unit between the vertical border and the central panel, the pattern is uninterrupted across the width of the piece. The final row corresponds to this row here directly under the post-it on my lift plan. Now, for a nice transition and to reflect the unraised unit at the side of the central panel, I like to have 2 plain rows between the bottom border and the central pattern. So that's what I'm going to do next. At this point, I start thinking about my 2 groups of shafts as separate entities. I'm going to drop all the shafts in the central panel. Then I address the 19 border shafts, dropping the ones I don't need for the next row. You can see pretty clearly how this is working, I think. And now I'm ready to weave the next 6 picks. I treadle 1 through 6, and you can see the white diamonds growing in the border while a solid brown strip grows in the middle. I drop some more shafts when I'm finished treadling and throw the shuttle 6 more times. I don't need my lift plan for this, since the simple diamond pattern is pretty easy to memorize. So now I'm ready to start weaving the pattern, which in this case is the rear ends of my cats. I see from the lift plan for the central panel that I need to raise shafts 7 through 13, so I'll do that first. The beginning of the 8 cats emerges. I mustn't forget that I also need to think about my borders, so I drop the necessary units there. And off I go, with an eerie silence because the guy across the street decided to start mowing his lawn at this point. If you've guessed that it's now time to weave 6 more picks, you're right. I rearrange my units, central panel, and borders too, and have at it again. This will go on for some time until I get to a good stopping place to check my work. So I've been weaving away for a while now, although not as long as you might think, because you definitely get into a rhythm when you're weaving on a Drawloom. And you can see that the frame is starting to take shape and the central panel is looking pretty good. Jensen and button are done, and the yarn balls are done, and the shuttles are almost done, and I've checked my waypoint to make sure my borders are where they need to be with respect to the pattern in the middle. It looks reasonable, so I will continue. Now I'm halfway through the piece. Although I've been checking as I go, at this point I like to really take stock and assess that everything is where I want it to be. I do a little happy dance when I confirm that the turning point in the central panel has occurred in the same row as the turning point in the vertical border, which it does. Yay! I can also double check that the thing is turning out square. I pull out my loyal tape measure and can see that I've got just under 31 centimeters there and just under 16 centimeters there. So that's good news. The pattern looks good. I haven't made any really egregious errors, so I'll reverse my pattern and continue out to the other side of the piece. When I'm done with the central pattern, I'll continue the border with the 2 plain rows in the middle for symmetry before I start the frame at the top of the piece. So here we are. I've finished up the central panel, including the 2 plain rows on the other side of the cats. You can see that here. You can also see I've reached the turning point for the diamonds in the vertical border. It's a bit of a suspenseful thing, but let's see what happens when I move my post-it to the next row. Look at that. I can see that I'm picking up the diamonds in the central panel exactly where I should be to make them match the ones at the vertical border. We are good to go. So I'm going to adjust my units at the sides, like so. Now I need to start the diamonds again in the middle. I like to lift my turning points first, so I've got a good reference point, and now, excuse my arms because I want to do this pretty fast. There we go. You can see my diamonds are marching right across the border, and I'm ready to finish weaving the piece. When it's done, I'll take it off the loom, flip it over so the right side is up, and marvel at my lovely, deep, symmetrical border frame.